Well, the Igarapé Institute works across a wide range of areas. We work globally, we work regionally, we work nationally. And we're always trying to get a better handle on the most vulnerable populations in any given situation, especially those populations who are affected by violence and insecurity, but also those who are exposed to deprivation, lack of development. And one of the populations that are the most, I would say, exposed to vulnerability are populations who've been displaced. People who are either crossing borders, in which case they're refugees, or people who are displaced internally, in which case they're internally displaced people. And right now in the world, we have about 68 million people who are displaced, either across the border because of violence as a refugee, or internally because of violence or some other set of causes internally. And when we talk about this issue, this phenomena of forced migration, we tend to think about Syria, we think about Afghanistan, we think about Sudan, we think about countries across Asia and Africa, and periodically countries in Latin America like Colombia and Central America. Very rarely does Brazil figure in this discussion. And what was striking for the Igarapé Institute when we started to look at this phenomena in Brazil was that it was actually much larger than many people imagined. This is an invisible crisis that has not really received the kinds of attention in Brazil that other types of phenomena have achieved. And so a lot of the concern in Brazil has been about the population of Venezuelans and Colombians who've come into the country because of conflicts in Colombia or because of political and economic crisis in Venezuela. And it's true, there are tens of thousands of Venezuelans and Colombians seeking refuge and asylum in Brazil. But very rarely do we talk about Brazilians who've been displaced internally, either because of natural disasters like floods and cyclones, or because of development projects like hydroelectric dams or mines, or because of violence, because of interfactional violence within gangs or militia or otherwise. And when we started to, tighten the lens and focus in on this phenomena, we found that there are more than 7.7 million Brazilians who've been displaced internally since 2000. And yet, nowhere was this being discussed in the national media. We tended to see little types of conversations focusing on refugees, or focusing maybe on some populations who've been displaced in the Serra, or maybe a few people who've been displaced by hydroelectric dams from Belo Monte. But never we looked at the global entirety. And for Igarapé Institute, it was really important, if we were going to have a serious policy conversation, to actually get the data on this phenomena right. We often don't have policy when there's no evident problem around which to form policy. There's an expression of see no, hear no, and as a result, we'll see kind of a policy vacuum when it comes to these kinds of phenomena. I think for a long time in Brazil, in a way, so long as this problem was far from view, it was confined to the countryside, to the Amazon, or to the coast areas where basically the centers of power weren't based. It was fine for policymakers in the private sector to, in a way, ignore the issue, to, in effect, not really acknowledge that it exists at all. And so in the absence of this information, in the absence, I would say, of an organized, coherent campaign and pressure from populations who are affected, but also populations who are sympathetic to these situations, in a way, there wasn't the kind of pressure on policymakers to take action. The other big challenge, I think, is because the issue is dispersed. We have people who are displaced from development, people who are displaced from natural disasters, and people who are displaced from violence. You have very different epistemic communities, very different types of legal centers of expertise, very different types of, let's say, quality of information and specialists working on the issues who didn't necessarily talk to one another. And so one population was addressed by one particular group of organizations and government agencies, another group of population was addressed by another sector of government, and a third was dealt with by another. And in a way, it was a confused, uncoordinated response. But what's striking when you look at these populations who are displaced is that they often have very similar types of characteristics. You'll see people who are exposed, who lack shelter, people who lack certain access to food and services, people who don't have access to education and health, people who are often living and thriving on remittances and on basically handouts. And so, in spite of the fact they may be displaced by different causes, be it a flood or be it a dam or be it violence, the experience of displacement is often very similar. And so one of the big challenges, I think, for governments is to develop a kind of all of government, a whole of government approach that brings together specialists in protecting people's rights, together with those who are responsible for providing services, together with those who are charged with providing some form of restitution and financial compensation, together with those that provide all the other ranges of activities that are needed. Instead, what we get are very uncoordinated, scattered, sort of divided responsibilities. And so what Brazil lacks right now is a centralized authority that actually looks and understands this challenge, that coordinates across different secretaries, ministries, and departments to be able to provide the kinds of needs that these populations require, but also that's able to create a communication channel with populations to be able to adjust the response and prevent future displacement before it actually occurs. And this is not just unique to Brazil. I think if you were to go to India, or if you go to perhaps parts of Central Asia or parts of Africa and other parts of Latin America, you'd see a similarly discoordinated, uncoordinated response. But it's important to stress that there are some internal factors also that resist responding to this population. Why? When you're displaced as a result of a dam, or you're displaced as a result of a natural disaster or violence, the state in a way is responsible for providing a basic provision of services and needs and goods to you as a citizen. If you don't exist, if you're not recorded, if you're not documented, it's hard for the state to have to respond. So in some cases, there's almost an internal bureaucratic resistance to developing a more coordinated response, and that has to change. Well, the good news is that there already are some examples of model legislation that are emerging around the world to address the rights and needs of individual citizens who've been displaced as a result of disasters or development, and to a less extent violence. In the case of development, the World Bank and different regional banks have actually developed a set of standards that address sort of key risk factors that citizens and individuals face when they're displaced, that provide for legal guarantees, that provide for compensation at a market or above market rates, that provide certain forms of services and goods for a certain period of time for people to allow them to get back on their feet after they've been displaced. And so I think within these model guidelines have been developed by banks and others, and some countries, for example, Canada, even the United States and parts of Europe, I think there are great examples that Brazil could draw from. In the case of violence-induced displacement, it's a little more complicated because often the actor who's responsible for inducing the displacement isn't necessarily known. They're often illegal. And so developing standards beyond the standard human rights provisions that ought to apply are a little more difficult. The good news is that there are what are called the internally displaced person guiding principles, which were an interagency process set up by the United Nations, designed specifically to set out the appropriate laws and legislations and provisions in laws to safeguard the rights, the protection in particular, but also the care and management of these populations, and to allow states to codify these into their existing national legislation. So, the point is that there are existing standards and rules out there. There are governments that have actually taken these kinds of standards and rules and applied them internally and codified them domestically. All of them focus on ensuring restitution, compensation for people who've lost their assets, both their fixed assets, but also some aspects of their livelihoods. All of them have provisions, special provisions for people who are most vulnerable, especially women and children, to ensure that there is long-term care provided. All of them have safeguards for providing life-saving assistance and relief for a particular period of time. So I think there is good news, which is that there are other countries out there that have actually put together provisions, and I think Brazil could benefit from those. It's really interesting. I mean, Brazil often, I'm a newcomer to Brazil, and what I've been struck by is that most of my Brazilian colleagues have often felt that Brazil didn't have a big problem with natural disasters. If you ask Brazilians, basically we don't have a lot of earthquakes, we don't actually have a lot of floods. I mean, periodically you'll have floods in some of the higher areas of Rio, for example, or parts of the interior. People often felt that there wasn't really these kinds of challenges. They were aware that there was issues of rising water. They were aware that the Sertão was getting hotter and becoming more difficult for people to live in. They were certainly aware of how cities were often concentrating risks in terms of climate-related risks. But generally, Brazilians have thought that theirs was not a country that was deeply affected by natural disasters. What was striking when we started this process of collecting hard data on people who've been displaced by natural disasters, development projects, and violence was just the sheer proportion and the scale of people who've been displaced from natural disasters, especially flash floods, but also the drying up of certain areas, droughts, as well as sort of rising sea levels in particular coastal areas, and mudslides and a whole manner of issues. And of course it's episodic, right? I mean, of course different years will have different amounts, but what's striking is that we're seeing a steadily increasing prevalence of these kinds of natural disasters and a growing number of Brazilians who are being displaced. It's not decreasing. If anything, it's stabilizing and slightly increasing. And so this is quite dramatic. And fortunately, Brazil actually keeps reasonably good, Brazilian government keeps reasonably good records on the populations who are displaced temporarily, because it often provides relief assistance to these population groups. Unfortunately, it doesn't keep a long-term track of these population groups. So after 6 months or a year and a half, we don't actually know what happens to this population, this category of population. Often we'll see people, because especially the poor and the vulnerable, who are forced into areas of high vulnerability and exposure to natural disasters, being being displaced multiple times. So this is a whole category which is extraordinary. As you said, roughly 70 to 80% of the entire caseload that we found were people who'd been displaced by natural disaster. The next largest group of population were people who've been displaced by development projects, by hydroelectric dams, which are the most famous. There's over 80 large hydroelectric dams in Brazil, but also from mining projects, from road building schemes, from urban renewal projects, from even building mega projects through the Olympics and the World Cup and other mega events. And roughly 1.5, 1.6 million people have been displaced from development. And that was striking. But this particular population group also gets certain kinds of access to restitution, but often they're given a set rate value on their existing assets. There is no negotiation. There is no adjustment for the market. And so what happens when suddenly there's a road building scheme is the prices can go down dramatically for these properties, because everyone knows that their land is going to be annexed and the government's going to take it over, and therefore the prices go down. So people often lose a lot when they're pushed off their land. Some gain, but many lose. The area where we had the least amount of information was really violence-induced displacement. And this is, from IGACP's perspective, one of the most interesting areas, but it's the hardest area to get good data on. When it comes to displacement from violence, there's reasonably good information out there on rural violence-related displacement. People who've been forced off their land by cattle ranchers, people who've had their land expropriated by elite landowners, for example. But the numbers there are relatively small, probably a couple of 100,000. I mean, small in Brazilian terms, large and when you think about it personally. We have virtually no information on the people who are displaced from cities. And if you consider that roughly 85 to 90% of Brazilians are living right now in an urban setting, this is a huge lacuna. Brazil has over 62,000 homicides in the last year for which we have data. We know that large numbers of Brazilians who can afford it are emigrating out of the country or are moving to safer cities in the south of the country as the north and northeast become more violent. We know that there's a lei de silencio, and people don't talk very much about their experience in cities when they're displaced because they're fearful that they may experience some retribution violence. So getting a handle on the scope and scale of displacement from violence is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. And I think if we were able to get the numbers right, this could dramatically increase the overall estimate of displaced people in the country. I mean, obviously it's not possible to prevent all forms of displacement due to natural disasters, but we can distinguish between slow onset disaster and sudden disaster. In the literature on disasters, often you'll talk about an instantaneous disaster result of a cataclysmic event, an earthquake or a sudden flash flood or a massive tidal wave from a tsunami. These kinds of events, while they are in a way predictable because we're able to look at seismic activity and predict the movement of different atmospheric pressure zones and understand the risks of certain areas. Those are really tough often to prevent, and you need to have safeguards in place in high-risk areas or vulnerable areas where that's going to occur. The problem is that often the most vulnerable people to these kinds of disasters are often the poorest people in a society. They're the ones who have the least access to resources. They're the ones who are forced into the most acutely chronically risk-prone areas in particular cities or on shorelines. And so it's tough because it's those people who are the most exposed, often have the least voice politically, and often have the least, I would say, will from government to be able to respond to those populations. In any case, it is possible to prevent those exposure to displacement if you're able to put in the safeguards in advance and the disaster risk mitigation measures in advance to limit the possibility of people being flooded or people hit by tidal wave or people hit by an earthquake. And that means having early warning systems in place. It means having data-driven alert systems in place that allow people sufficient time to be able to flee before an event occurs. It means having zoning restrictions so that you don't build in areas that are going to be particularly exposed to a high-risk sudden onset event. It means having communication networks with other partners, both in Brazil and across Brazil, so that you have the data in the right place to be able to anticipate what's going to happen. It means educating your population and visiting schools and visiting community centers and ensuring that the population understands how to respond in the event of a disaster. Often what happens is, people can get away, but it's in the flight that people actually get hurt, that get killed in the course of trying to flee. It means having systems in place when that disaster occurs to look after this population when they move. So there are ways of dealing with sudden onset. It's hard, but they're there. For the longer term, slow-moving disasters, here I think there really is a way to prevent displacement. We know, for example, that large majority of the population of Brazil lives on the coastline. Well over 60% of the population live just on a very thin margin of the coast. We also know that depending on temperature changes, we could see sea level rises of between 5 centimeters and 5 feet, depending on the elevation and the location. We know exactly what's going to happen in Santos, in Victoria, in Magé, in different parts of the northeast, up all the way around to Belém. The challenge will be, how do we put in place the strategies for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years so that we don't keep building populations directly in the most exposed areas? We have the same problem in places like Miami or Amsterdam or Shanghai right now around the world, where large proportions of the population are moving ever more on the coast, and yet it's precisely those areas that are going to go under. And no amount of wetland restoration or coastal recovery or break walls in the water are going to prevent some of that water coming in, because the land underneath it is often porous, it's built on clay, so you're going to see water rising. So having zoning rules in place that don't allow for the building of residential and commercial areas in precisely those areas that we're going to see the largest water rise is going to be critical. More importantly, I think, as you look into the interior, is also addressing the drying of the climate, not just rising sea levels, but also drought. Areas where we're seeing increasing amounts of dryness and people fleeing. We know that we're going to have certain parts of Brazil that are going to experience acute forms of water shortage that it's already happening. We also know that more than 850 cities in Brazil right now are facing chronic rolling water shortages. We know that part of that has to do with diminishing water ground reserves, but also surface water. So developing strategies right now around how can we strengthen access to water, how can we mitigate the effects of increasing drought, how can we plan for population growth in ways that are not going to exacerbate that, but also going to minimize the possibility of displacement now, is going to be critical. Look, in the next sort of 30, 40 years, we're going to see more than 1.5 billion people on the move because of climate stress. This is not just in Brazil. Our problem as human beings is that we often can't think ahead. We don't think, and it's the burning frogs and the boiling frog syndrome. We struggle to be able to see incremental changes in our environment, and therefore we don't make adaptations to our behavior and our planning now when we should be. We have the data right now, we have the information to be able to make the smart choices. The question is, do our policymakers and our corporate leaders have the wisdom to be able to develop the right planning strategies to mitigate the exposure of people now, rather than wait until the last minute? So getting a handle on displacement from violence in Brazil, I think, is one of the most challenging parts of this project. People don't self-report when they're on the move. Often they're too afraid to put their names forward to the public authorities. Often they're worried about retribution from a gang or a militia or a mafia group that forced a displacement in the first place. Often they leave, they don't leave a trace. They may leave the country or they may leave to another city, and it's very difficult to follow this population group. We estimate that it's in the hundreds of thousands, possibly the millions, when you put real hard data around it. But I think the first order of business is let's develop some methodologies to start better understanding the extent to which people are being forced off their land in rural parts of Brazil, whether it's indigenous populations or minority populations or extremely poor populations forced off their land, but also what's happening in our cities. I'll mention that I'm getting many reports these days from lawyers, from immigration lawyers in particular, in the States and in Western Europe right now, about Brazilians who are seeking asylum in these countries. I never used to get these phone calls. I used to get phone calls like that from people from Haiti or people from Central America or people from Central Africa. But more and more Brazilians are moving away, seeking refugee and political asylum for fear of retributive violence at home. So this is a big problem about which we don't know very much right now. So if we want to prevent it, if we want to increase the possibilities that people are not forced out of their homes because of violence, we first have to understand how big is the challenge, how is it distributed, what populations are most at risk. The next thing I think we have to think about is what are the frontline institutions that are available to provide people with the protection in the event that they are feeling under threat from being forced to move. And here we're talking about witness protection programs. We're talking about human rights programs that allow citizens to be able to report intimidation, harassment, threats, and relocation programs in the event that people are really exposed to a point where their lives or their families' lives are at risk. These programs do exist in Brazil. They're scattered, they're underfunded, they're not particularly well known, and they certainly aren't sufficiently large enough to accommodate the populations that are on the move. But we absolutely need to expand the protection networks in this country, the frontline human rights related networks, the informational networks to allow citizens to understand what's happening. The next issue is we have to inform our law enforcement and our criminal justice systems about this challenge. I think it's because it's not recognized in the media and because it's not discussed in the research community, it's not surprising that our law enforcement criminal justice institutions aren't particularly seized of the issue or aware of its magnitude. So that's going to be critical as well. The good news is, again, there are other countries that have dealt with this. Colombia in particular, for example, has got millions, over 6 million people who've been displaced internally from violence as a result of 50 years of war. I'm not suggesting Colombia's got it right, but they set up a specific national commission and a series of committees to, first of all, get a handle on the magnitude of the crisis. Second of all, to start ensuring there's provision of services to these populations that are displaced from violence. Third of all, having judicial processes to persecute people who are forcing people off their land. Fourth of all, to set up committees of inquiry to look at the underlying causes that are driving this, especially when it involves elites who are pushing people off land with using force in order to get access to land. So there are experiences in places like Colombia, parts of the Americas, including also in the United States and Canada, albeit at a much smaller scale, that are addressing these issues. And Brazil absolutely needs to learn from those experiences. The best experiences we have right now are probably from places like Colombia, parts of the Balkans, for example, that have experienced conflicts. India has also been experimenting with all sorts of novel methods. China as well, although has a very different kind of government, so the extent to which lessons can be transferable are more limited. But I think the first point that all of these countries that have dealt with large-scale displacement have is having early warning detection. Having a system in place, a system of data collection, often administered by government in partnership with the private sector and or civil society and academia, that centralizes data and that provides a kind of more real-time access to information so that the public, and the public sector in particular, has a better understanding of what's going on. Without data, you're flying blind. So great experiences, I think, in many countries in creating centralized data repositories. And that may require a law to set up this particular institution that would centralize information. It certainly requires funds, and it requires expertise. The good news in Brazil is that there are universities, there are civil society groups, there are, I think, interested public sector actors who really genuinely want to see a more coherent response. The second, I think, factor is setting up a ministry or a department in a way responsible for these kinds of issues. Of course, it's impossible to centralize all the requirements of dealing for these populations, both before they're displaced and after. But having some kind of entity, an institution that aggregates responsibilities, that codifies the laws, that sets out standards and principles, that provides training to the state and the city level actors who are really dealing with these issues on the front line is critical. I think the third factor is the role of cities. Cities here, but also around the world increasingly, are the front line for populations who are displaced. But cities often don't have the resources or the discretion or the authority to be able to respond to these populations adequately. Too often they're overwhelmed. And the result is that the local population ultimately stigmatizes these groups who come in. They resent them for stealing services in their view, or putting pressure on existing service providers. So providing cities with the authority and the discretion and the training and the expertise is critical. And so there are networks of cities around the world that are actually out there providing support to frontline cities to be able to learn the right approaches to deal with these populations in terms of integration, in terms of providing the basic services like health, education, documentation, protection, legal services, and the whole panoply of activities. So if you went to, for example, Athens, or if you went to Cologne, or if you went to Oslo or Malmo or Stockholm, or to even some of the cities in the U.S., the so-called sanctuary cities in the United States, you'll have a huge reservoir of experience from those cities on how they dealt with populations, for better and for worse, how they were challenged. So I think that there are multiple experiences out there that I think we can draw on in Brazil that could improve the response overall. Haiti is an extraordinary country. A country of people it's the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, but it's also an incredibly resilient country where populations do an extraordinary amount with very, very little and are able to survive in extraordinarily difficult conditions. One of the big challenges, I think, in Haiti, going back decades, is that it's become a kind of what we call republic of NGOs. There are more NGOs per capita in Haiti than anywhere else on the planet. And the result is that there is a tremendous amount of activity, many people who I think have good intentions, but an enormous amount of discoordination or uncoordination. So that when disasters hit, as they often do in Haiti, whether it's a hurricane or whether it's, in the case of 2010, a massive, unprecedented earthquake, there is a mad rush to do something, but often it's done in a duplicative, replicative, uncoordinated, and often quite inefficient way. And this sets expectations for Haitians who have an expectation of receiving basic responses and support, but often they get very different types of activity and support. And in many cases, we're seeing a lot of the money that was intended for Haitians disappears and is going into funding salaries of international organizations. Again, I'm not besmirching international agencies. I think they're doing incredible work. I just think it's often very difficult to corral these groups in a way that's effective. The second big challenge, I think, in Haiti is that the result of this surplus of NGOs means that the government itself hasn't really built the capabilities and capacities to be able to respond itself. And as a result, Haitians don't look to their government for support, they look to NGOs. And this further undermines the legitimacy and capability and frankly, capacity of public institutions to give a positive response. So this challenge of an overabundance of NGOs and an undercapacity of the state means that often we get a subpar level of service for Haitians. The third big challenge is that many Haitians don't have access to property. They don't own their property. They don't have title to their property. Similar kind of situation, I think, in large parts of Brazil and frankly across Latin America and the Caribbean. So that when disaster hits and you literally lose everything, you don't have the papers to demonstrate or prove that you own this land, nor do you have access to the land and the collateral that one can generate from the land to be able to generate the kind of resources to be able to restart your business. And this is extremely difficult. So it means that you move from a situation of poverty into ever deeper forms of poverty. Very difficult to escape this trap. The fourth big challenge related to that, I think, is just around agriculture. A lot of these disasters have hit specifically during sort of the harvesting season or just during the planting seasons. And this is sort of rolling case. In the case of cyclones and natural disasters, they often hit precisely at the time when Haitians are planting. When you lose that season, you lose multiple seasons as a result because you've got to refertilize your land and reprepare your land. And this again creates a deep, deep food insecurity. And I think one of the things to remember about Haiti is that the vast majority of Haitians are extraordinarily resourceful. They often turn to their families or friends outside of the country during times of crisis. And I think often the international community overestimates its importance in its response. We did a study a couple of years ago that found that less than 15% of Haitians actually had access to international relief or a government handout. The vast majority, more than 80%, were basically making their own way. They didn't have any access to food or aid or health or education or any of the services that are being offered because this is a very rural country. Most people live in the countryside, and the NGOs didn't go that far. So who do they rely on? Well, they rely on international remittances. The vast majority of Haitians were able to survive because of their uncles or their aunts or their cousins and friends who are living in New York or living in Paris or living in Montreal or living in Rio de Janeiro, who are sending them money and who are providing them assistance, and they were able to get themselves back on their feet that way. So I think the lesson from Haiti is we have to get a lot smarter as an international community in terms of how we think about support. Recognize that we have to start by helping Haitians help themselves, that Haitians have the resources and the capabilities themselves to be able to take the kinds of urgent remedial measures that are required, and to facilitate those existing networks, those existing connections they have so they can get the job done. I think one of the biggest challenges for resettlement projects is the fact that the people who are often the most likely to be resettled are often the poorest, the most vulnerable in a community. They're also the ones who are least likely to have access to land title. In other words, a deed or some kind of formal legal recognition of their property. This is incredibly difficult because from the perspective of a government or a private sector actor who's undertaking this displacement, or in the case of natural disaster and violence, if you can't produce a deed, then the government may just expropriate your land and provide you nothing in return. Even if from a common law or customary law perspective, you have access to that land, that may not be recognized in the course of the government or the private sector expropriating and alienating that land. And what that means is that you are basically at the mercy of the state or the private sector. It means that you can't negotiate the terms of a resettlement. It means that when you leave, you're much poorer in your new location where you're sent. And it's really important to stress that when resettlement often happens in places like Brazil or India or China, what happens is people are relocated from an area where they may have a strong social network, where they may have connections of livelihood and commercial relationships, and they're often moved to marginal land, often far away from where they were, often not connected through highways or transportation corridors or market networks to where they were. They're often not given a lot of choice in where they go. And we often talk about orphan settlements or isolated communities that are created as a result, which actually result in people being worse off than they were before. In any resettlement process, there'll be some winners and losers, but the challenge that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, including here in Brazil, is the vast majority of people who are resettled are losers in the process. A very small number actually do better out of it. And so the question is, how do we ensure that we maximize the benefits for people who are moving? How do we minimize the displacement projects or the displacement events to reduce the number of people who are displaced? Rather than investing in big mega schemes, can we think about smaller, more distributed schemes that have less of an impact on individuals and the environment? And how do we create the restitution and compensation that's fair, that ensures that at a minimum, people are not moving from poverty into more poverty, that people's lives are improved in the process?